November 5th, 2009, was just a normal Thursday for the soldiers at Fort Hood in Texas. They went about their business as usual, unaware of what was about to happen. At 1:34 p.m., Major Nadal Hassan, an Army psychiatrist, walked into the Soldier Readiness Processing Center, as he had done several times before. However, this time would be very different. He walked to the first desk on the right, sat down, and bowed his head for a few seconds. Suddenly, he stood up, shouted, "Allah Akbar," and opened fire. When it was all said and done, he had killed 13 people and injured 32 others. This was the worst mass murder at a U.S. military installation in history. What made it even worse is that it could have been prevented. Almost a year before the shooting, the FBI intercepted a chain of emails between Hassan and Anwar al-Awlaki, a radical Islamic cleric with ties to the 9/11 attackers. Hassan emailed al-Awlaki to ask him whether serving in the U.S. military was compatible with the Muslim faith. He also asked whether al-Awlaki considered those who died attacking their fellow soldiers to be martyrs. However, officials claimed these emails were fairly benign. The military judge on the case also barred the prosecutor from presenting them as evidence, saying they would cause unfair prejudice. Why did the FBI not take action to stop Hassan from committing this crime? I would say it was because he was a Muslim, and they could have been accused of racial profiling or discriminating based on religion. The truth is, the fear of being accused of profiling cost 13 individuals their lives. Unfortunately, this is not a case of political correctness gone too far. This is a case of political correctness fulfilling precisely what it's supposed to do. I'm going to argue that political correctness was originally intended to destroy and to eradicate Western civilization itself. The term political correctness is used all the time, but do we really know what it means? Political correctness can be defined as the idea that people should be careful to not use language or behave in a way that could offend a particular group of people. This idea actually originated during World War I. According to Marxist theory, if a major war ever broke out in Europe, the working class from every nation would join together in order to bring about a revolution of international communism. This theory was quickly proven false when a major war did break out and there was no communist revolution. This left Marxists to figure out what went wrong. Two Marxist theorists, Antonio Gramsci in Italy and George Lukács in Hungary, independently came up with the same answer. They said that Western culture and the Christian religion had blinded the working class to its true interest. Communism was impossible in the West until traditional culture and Christianity had been destroyed. Lukács even said, quote, "Who will save us from Western civilization?" End quote. In 1919, Lukács implemented his theory by instituting radical sex education courses into Hungarian schools. As a deputy commissioner for culture under the Bolshevik Belakoon government, he knew that destroying traditional sexual morals and the unity of the family would be a major step to destroying Western culture itself. However, the Belakoon government only lasted a few months, partly because of the working class outraged by Lukács' assault on traditional Western culture and morals. In 1923, a Marxist think tank was established in Germany with the goal to translate Marxism from economic to cultural terms, or to establish cultural Marxism. It was originally going to be named the Institute for Marxism, but it was decided that it was not to their advantage to be openly identified as Marxist. Instead, it was named the Institute for Social Research and became more commonly known as the Frankfurt School. They argued that just as under capitalism, everyone lived in a state of economic oppression, under Western civilization, people lived under psychological repression. When the Frankfurt School moved to New York City in 1933, they developed something called critical theory, which was a constant criticism of every traditional social institution, starting with the family. They also created a series of studies in prejudice, culminating in the book The Authoritarian Personality, which argued that anyone who defended traditional culture was a fascist and mentally ill. While we have only recently started to call it political correctness, the cultural Marxist ideology has slowly worked its way into Western culture. Political correctness is cultural Marxism, and its end goal is to destroy Western culture in order to establish global communism. So how has political correctness manifested itself in modern society? If its goal is to destroy Western civilization, how has it intended to do that? I see three main areas it has done this. It has progressively broken down the family, relativized religion, and dumbed down education. Destroying these three areas has led to the demise of Western civilization. First, the founders of Marxism knew that they would have to break down the family in order to establish communism. Karl Marx states in the Communist Manifesto, quote, "Abolition of the family. Even the most radical flare up at this infamous proposal of the communists," end quote. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels are considered to be the founders of Marxism. If you read their writings, it becomes clear that they were not fans of the traditional family. Their final partnership was an 1884 book published by Engels titled The Origin of the Family. In an analysis of this work, Dr. Paul Kenger states, quote, "There we see a fanatical push to abolish all rights of inheritance, to end home and religious education, to dissolve monogamy in marriage, to pursue pre- and extramarital sex, to foster and tolerate the gradual growth of unconstrained sexual intercourse by unmarried women, to nationalize all housework, to shift mothers into factories, to move children into daycare nurseries, to separate children into community collectives apart from their natural parents, and most of all, for society and the state to rear and educate children," end quote. As Engels says, quote, "The single family ceases to be the economic unit of society. Private housekeeping is transformed into a social industry. The care and education of the children becomes a public affair, and society looks after all children alike, whether they are legitimate or not," end quote. These ideas would be developed in more detail in the Communist Manifesto of 1848. Here, we see a 10-point plan for the advancement of communism. They are all very radical ideas, and some of them directly undermine the family. The two most obvious are points 3 and 10. Point 3 is the abolition of the right to inheritance. Inheritance perpetuates the traditional role of the family. A society cannot be equal when some people unjustly receive more money from their parents. Thus, inheritance must be eliminated. Point 10 is to provide free education for all children. While this might seem appealing at first, it is actually an attempt to separate the family. Education was traditionally the role of the parents, and Marx and Engels knew that if they controlled the education, they would control the thoughts of the next generation. They wanted children separated from the parents as much as possible. They should be viewed as property of the state. As the communist agenda progressed, it became clear that homosexuality was a natural outworking of Marxist thought, as it undermines the family. When Marx and Engels were writing the Communist Manifesto, they would have never even considered the idea of promoting homosexuality. But while many Marxists may have not been proponents of it at first, they soon realized that as long as the traditional family was destroyed, Marxism would be advanced. Destroying the family is the goal of advocates of the homosexual agenda, and they don't even try to hide it. As Paula Edelbrick, former legal director of Lambda Legal Defense and Education Fund and homosexual activist, explains, quote, "Being queer means pushing the parameters of sex, sexuality, and the family, and in the process transforming the very fabric of society. We must keep our eyes on the goals of providing true alternatives to marriage, and of radically reordering society's views of reality," end quote. Likewise, Masha Gresson, an accomplished writer, author, and gay rights activist, argues that, quote, "Fighting for gay marriage generally involves lying about what we're going to do with marriage when we get there, because we lie that the institution of marriage is not going to change. The institution of marriage is going to change, and it should change. And again, I don't think it should exist," end quote. This rhetoric is very similar to that of Marx and Engels. This is because the homosexual agenda is just another outworking of cultural Marxism. Their true goal is to not gain equal rights for homosexuals. Homosexuality is only a convenient tool to promote their agenda, which is to destroy the family and Western civilization as a whole. Marx and Engels knew that their ideas were so radical that people would never support them, so they needed a way to get them implemented. As Marx admits, quote, "Of course in the beginning this cannot be effected except by means of despotic inroads," end quote. As Dr. Kenger explains, quote, "Marxism was not hijacked by despots. Marxism demanded despots. Only a fool would not instantly, intuitively realize that implementing this vision would necessarily generate mass bloodshed," end quote. That's a quick solution, and it did work in Russia for a short time. The other approach is the one suggested by the Frankfurt School, cultural Marxism, known today as political correctness. This is a long-term plan, but it works just as well. After about 200 years, the Marxists have finally been able to destroy the family. In addition to being harmful to the family, political correctness is also harmful to religion, specifically Christianity. Marx and Engels argued that religion was a method of oppression of the masses and must be destroyed in order for communism to be established. According to Marx, quote, "Religion is the sigh of the oppressed preacher, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of the soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people," end quote. He also stated that, quote, "My objective in life is to dethrone God and to destroy capitalism," end quote. He viewed Christianity as a way for the rich to restrain workers so that they would not revolt. He made it clear that his ideology would mean the death of Christianity and all religion. Quote, "As socialism grows, religion will disappear," end quote. We can see this in the history of communism as well. In the Soviet Union, Christianity was aggressively persecuted, and atheism was promoted by the state. Today, even though there is no official persecution of Christianity, religious freedom is still under attack. Time after time, Christians are being told that they cannot freely practice their faith because it is intolerant. One great example is Barronelle Stutzman, the owner of Arlene's Flowers in Richland, Washington. Barronelle had served and employed people who identify as homosexual for her entire career, but she recently declined to use her creative skills to beautify the same-sex ceremony of a longtime customer because it violated her religious beliefs. She was sued by the ACLU in the state of Washington for unlawful discrimination. The court ruled against Barronelle. Alliance Defending Freedom took the case to the Washington Supreme Court, but unfortunately the court still ruled against her. ADF then petitioned the United States Supreme Court to take up Barronelle's case, and we are currently waiting the court's decision. Barronelle is just one of many instances where Christians have been targeted in modern society. As you can see, modern political correctness has the same anti-religion sentiments as the philosophy of Marx and Engels. Since it stems from the Marxist tradition, its original intent was to destroy religion, and it is doing that extremely effectively. The final area that political correctness has had a negative impact is education. The education system in America today is in shambles, but only about 200 years ago, we had one of the strongest education systems in the world. How can we go from such a high quality of education to such a low quality of education in such a relatively short period of time? Is it just that our students have become less gifted, or was this decline very intentional? One of the first education laws in America was passed in Massachusetts in 1647, called Ye Old Deluder Satan Act. It stated, quote, "It being one chief project of that old deluder, Satan, to keep men from the knowledge of the Scriptures, it is therefore ordered that every township in this jurisdiction appoint one within their town to teach all such children to write and read." End quote. They knew that if you wanted to maintain a moral society, you needed to have a population who could read. In 1787, the Northwest Ordinance was drafted by the same people who signed the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. In it, they wrote that, quote, "Religion, morality, and knowledge, being necessary to the good government and the happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall be forever encouraged." End quote. Schools needed to be established so that we could instill religion, morality, and knowledge in our citizens. Without these things, we cannot have good government. Historically, schools often used the pastor's sermon from Sunday as a part of the lesson plan. This implied that not only was the sermon of high enough quality that it was worthy of studying, but also that the students and the teachers were in church. Also, schools would use a book called the New England Primer to teach students to read. The way it taught reading is very different from how we teach it today. Most of us have probably learned that A is for apple, but according to the New England Primer, A is for Adam. Quote, "In Adam's fall, we sinned all." End quote. From the first letter of the alphabet, students are being taught one of the most fundamental truths of this world. Education today has strayed far from this standard. America now consistently ranks in the middle of the pack compared to other countries around the world. Not only has the educational standard decreased, but we have removed God from education. We've separated the facts from faith. You can have whatever personal beliefs you want, but you cannot question scientific facts. We can see this clearly with Obama's bathroom law. In 2016, the federal government told schools that they must allow transgender students to use bathrooms that correspond with their gender identity, rather than the gender listed on their birth certificate. If they did not, the Obama administration threatened to cut federal funding. It is clear that the education system today is fostering a very different vision of the world than what it used to in America. So what caused this massive shift? As Dr. Roger Erdvig pointed out, quote, "We are immersed in a culture that seems to be off the rails." My question to you is, are we off the rails, or are we actually on the rails of ideas that have been laid down over time in education, such that it should be no surprise where we are today? In fact, if we really are surprised, we've been asleep at the wheel. So what are the ideas that have shaped education? I would argue that they are actually Marxist ideals that have influenced education. If you look at the education system today, it seems to be taken directly out of the playbook of Marx and Engels. In the last of Marx and Engels' 10 points, they argue that there should be free education for all children in public schools. The reason why they wanted free education is because then the state can control what the children are learning. They needed to make sure that children were not learning the values of their parents. This is why Marx also stated that, quote, "The education of all children from the moment that they can get along without a mother's care shall be in state institutions," end quote. Those who control the education control the minds of the next generation. Marxists control our state-run schools, and the values that they are teaching are increasingly secular, communist, and politically correct. Education is yet another area that cultural Marxism has been slowly destroying Western civilization. Therefore, I have concluded that political correctness has been destroying Western civilization by breaking down the family, relativizing religion, and dumbing down education. This has been its goal all along, since it has stemmed from Marxist thought. Now, there are some people who say that political correctness is actually beneficial for society. They claim that the goal is simply to stop people from being mean to others by using rude and foul language. According to Marty Stiros for the Huffington Post, quote, "What political correctness mostly comes down to is not being a jerk to others. In other words, political correctness could almost be interchanged with the word respect or kindness or with the act of being non-judgmental," end quote. Political correctness teaches us how to be respectful to those who might be from a different background than we are. While it is certainly good to be polite and respectful, is that really what political correctness does? If you look at what actually happened, one of the main effects it has had is destroying free speech. There are countless examples of this. An Xbox player who put his hometown, Fort Gay, West Virginia, on his Xbox Live profile was banned by Microsoft because it was, quote, "inappropriate in any context," end quote. Santa Clauses in Australia were forced to stop saying the traditional phrase of "ho ho ho" because it could frighten children and be derogatory to women. These might seem unbelievable, but they are real events that actually happen. This is the logical outworking of political correctness. It's not an unfortunate side effect of the otherwise well-intentioned idea. This is the goal of cultural Marxism, to destroy free speech and eventually Western civilization as a whole. The saddest part is that it's working. Many people today do not believe in the freedom of speech, but rather in the freedom from speech they dislike. The way society is headed, politically correct speech codes might extend into actual law. Political correctness is not a matter of just not being a jerk to others. People are too afraid to speak their minds, because offending someone could mean ruining their reputation or destroying their career. Additionally, political correctness has no problem being a jerk to Christians or conservatives. They claim that they are champions of politeness, yet hurl insults at Donald Trump and other conservatives. Why are you only allowed to insult certain groups of people and not others? Political correctness has taken out one of the fundamental pillars of Western civilization, free speech. Additionally, the definition of political correctness assumes a false premise. Those who argue for political correctness assume that avoiding offensive language is good. But is that really the case? If we were to avoid speaking about any topics that could be considered offensive, we would get nothing accomplished in society. We must risk offending others in the pursuit of truth. Sometimes, the truth can be very offensive. When asked in an interview, why should your freedom of speech trump a trans person's right to not be offended, Professor Jordan Peterson of the University of Toronto responded, well, because in order to be able to think, you have to risk being offensive. I mean, look at the conversation we're having right now. You're certainly willing to risk offending me in pursuit of truth. Why should you have the right to do that? It's been rather uncomfortable, end quote. The fear of being offensive is actually harmful to society. While political correctness may have infiltrated much of Western society, the good news is that it will not last much longer. Many people are beginning to reject the idea that you must always guard what you say to avoid being intolerant. According to Ben Shapiro, quote, "The era of political correctness is over. Political correctness is dying a slow, painful, bloody, agonizing death, and all I can say is hell yeah," end quote. However, Ben Shapiro also pointed out that we will need to do two things to make sure that the age of political correctness does not return. Quote, "If we want to end political correctness and rebuild on the foundations that our forefathers fought and bled and died for, we'll need to stand with decency and with truth," end quote. If we successfully do these two things, we will continue to see America return to the values of Western civilization that it was founded on. We will win this war because America was founded on truth and decency, and this is not a war that we can afford to lose.